TVR. There's been a bit of a break since the last episode, and quite a lot has actually happened during the COVID lockdown. So as you can see in front of you, last time we left it, the car was in a pretty poor state actually. The chassis was all rusty. We pointed out a lot of the fixing points and some of the issues with the chassis. So what's actually happened since the last time is that the chassis went away to a local shop blasting place. It was cleaned. Then I took it up to Sheffield to RT Racing. RT Racing then had it on the jig, and they replaced these outriggers. So they basically chopped the outriggers off here at the central spine area. Okay, here, chopped them off there, chopped it off along here as well, and then chopped halfway along there. So all of that disappeared. Same on the other side. That then went onto a jig. They then fabricated new outriggers, welded those on, and then another company called Bore Coatings, which are also in Sheffield, they then picked the chassis up from RT Racing. They then shot blasted it again. They then thermally aluminium sprayed it, I think to 100 microns I believe. Then they then sealed that. Then they then applied a 2-pack paint on top of that, and I think it's a final top coat of white gloss, which you can see now. It's a specification that they use for, I can't remember now whether it's Network Rail or the Highways Agency or one of these organisations. Supposedly it's 25 years before first maintenance, so hopefully a bit more hard wearing than the original powder coat when it left the factory in '97. So where are we up to at the moment is we're we've made all of the brake lines. So I bought a Sykes Pickavant kit and fabricated all of these brake lines. So you've got these two here. These then find their way round to the front of the car, the offside and near side. They're all held in with tie wraps, which how they were originally. Then you've got this one here, which then comes along, routes its way underneath here. Then eventually it tees off onto there, and then goes left and right to the two rear wheels. So I've made all of those lines. Also installed the fuel line, so you can see one that's just under here. That's the return line, and then this is the supply line here. So we're just waiting for hoses to go on. What else have we done? We're actually, the differential has been away. So the chap called John Reed, he's ex TVR, well, he still runs the Tuscan Challenge series. He's actually rebuilt the diff, he's done the gearbox. The diff's actually come back with a different ratio. So the differential originally was a 345 to 1, is now a 308 to 1. So I've decided to change the ratio on the diff because I'm running quite a lot more horsepower than original, and I just didn't need that such a high ratio. So that's now a 308. The gearbox, that's got a different tail housing on. I think it's called an S10. So originally the gear stick comes out, or the linkage comes out of the tail housing around here, and then you have this linkage which then comes forward and then locates on the back of the bell housing. This different tail housing has put the linkage at the front of the tail housing, so it should be more direct, the gear change when we do that. And then it just requires the fabrication of a slightly different gearbox mount because these holes have moved forward by about 90mm. The prop shaft has been rebuilt with new universal joints, so that's ready to go back in the car. These rear suspension has been built with new bushes. I decided to stick with the new bushes, the original type bushes on the back. These are the rubber metal, the metal inner outer rubber in, I think they're called metallistic or something, bushes. So I spoke to quite a few people and I wasn't that convinced of necessarily all of the benefits with going to polyurethane. I think a lot of people fit polyurethane bushes because they're easy to fit. You can push them in with your fingers. Having said that, on the front I did have originally Powerflex bushes, so I contacted Powerflex. I had a bit of a problem with the polyurethane originally that was in there. They'd sort of distorted and gone to a different shape. So what I did was that they weren't willing to just sell me the polyurethane bits. So what I did is I bought some polyurethane off of eBay of the correct shore hardness. I put it in the freezer, and then I actually then machined my own polyurethane bushes on the lathe and then rebuilt the front suspension bushes that way. It was a lot cheaper than buying new Powerflex kit. I also changed obviously all of the bolts and everything that are in there, and I made my own nylon washers that go in there, so I just turned those on the lathe. So what else has happened? So I rebuilt, put new ball joints top and bottom there, and then I rebuilt the steering rack. So the steering rack was a bit of a pain. So a lot of people send the rack off to Kylie Clinton or one of the other rack refurbishing companies. I decided that I wanted to have a go myself. Almost regretted it, but not quite. So I ended up buying a seal kit. Now the problem with rebuilding a power steering rack, okay, the biggest problem, it's quite well documented how to do it on the internet, is that there's an oil seal which sits about there on the rack. Okay, so the piston sits in here and it moves between these two ports. Okay, and there's a seal that sits there. Now that seal is very difficult to remove. Some people use a screwdriver from that end when they take the nut off to get to it, but then they end up just scoring the bore trying to do that. So what I had to do is I ended up making this tool here, which you know, if you've got access to a lathe, that's possible, but if you haven't got access to a lathe, that's quite difficult. So basically what happened was that you feed this tool into the bore, this locates into the bore of the rack, okay, and then what then happens is, when I originally made this was all straight and parallel. It's because it's being used now that they've splayed out. But what then happens is you feed that in, get these fingers behind that seal, and then you then tighten this nut up, which draws this nut in and pushes the fingers out. Also using a video probe fed through this nylon bush to be able to see the fingers go behind the seal, and then a slide hammer arrangement to pull the whole thing out. So yeah, it took me a little while to actually make that. Not everyone has got the tools and equipment in their garage to do that. So that's pretty much it really. So we've rebuilt to this stage. The engine's currently at V8 development, so that's being rebuilt. So we should get that back in the next few weeks. After that, we'll then be putting the engine and gearbox in. We're making a new mount for the gearbox because, as I said, the mounting's slightly further forward. And you know, we'll be looking at preparing the engine bay ready for the body to go back onto the car. We've got to put the handbrake cable and handbrake back on. We've also got to put the flexible hoses back on and put the fuel lines on. And we've also got to put this fuel pump on. So I'm just messing around with this larger Bosch fuel pump than the original. And obviously I've had to make a bracket which is just being painted at the moment. So that will then bring it back to the original studs, and that will sit in the original place. And that is pretty much it. Oh, one last thing, did make a bit of an error, and that is when I took the drive shafts off, I didn't make a note of which way round they went, because they're the same length and they've got the same CV joints on both ends. So when I went to see a chap, he said, oh, that's no good. So I ended up having some new drive shafts made at Beresford. They gave them a drawing and a specification of the dimensions as to where the circlip grooves are. They've made them out of S155 or 300M steel. I then bought some CV joints, so I built those up. I'm just now waiting for some new bolts to hold them on. I've just got them temporarily held on with the old bolts just to hold them in place at the moment until the new bolts arrive. And that is pretty much it really. So that's where we're at the moment. So we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you very much.